Hello, everybody. My name is Nick Hertz. I'm a UX researcher here at GitLab, and I want to talk to you today about the System Usability Scale survey results from Q2 FY22. At a very high level, our System Usability Scale score for this quarter was 68.3. This was a relatively large sample size of about 916 responses. This 68.3 represents a 0.2 point increase from the previous quarter. Although this is not a statistically significant increase, this is a solid stabilization after about 8 quarters of pretty consistent decline. So this is a very positive sign in terms of overall SUS score. Our SUS score was broken down by cohort, basically looking at 4 distinct groups, and these were all relatively evenly sampled. What we're looking for between these groups is any meaningful difference, so anything outside the margin of error. And in this case, we only saw one statistically significant difference, and that is that of between the new users and mature users, with new users having significantly lower SUS score. Some of the reasons for this we'll kind of come to in a little bit, but the moral of the story is it's hard to learn GitLab. So there seems to be a learnability issue within GitLab, which is kind of lowering some of these scores, especially for new users. Additionally, we see paid and new have declined, but it's also important to note these also have the lowest overall score. And again, we'll look at possible reasons later, but I believe some of these are related to learnability. And so having looked at the ratings and the verbatims, it appears that learnability, complexity, and consistency are some of the major reasons or themes driving our overall SUS score. So if we take a deeper look into the SUS score, the individual questions in particular, what we're looking for is on the individual questions, scores that are lower than the overall SUS. So anything lower than 68.3, those questions, if they are lower, indicate areas of concern for us. So we use those themes to kind of dig deeper into the questions and uncover other usability issues. So in this case, you can kind of see the ones highlighted in yellow, and I'll also dive deeper into these as well. As I was mentioning earlier, it's hard to learn GitLab. So learning GitLab can be difficult, and we see that reflected in the 2 questions related to learnability within GitLab. Although we've seen increase in both these questions in this quarter compared to the previous quarter, these are still 2 of our lowest scoring SUS scores, and what is kind of bringing the overall SUS score down as well. So just to kind of look a little bit deeper in this, I pulled out a couple of verbatims, but more than 30 verbatims mentioned a steep learning curve or users requesting tools to make GitLab easier to learn. So some examples are, documentation wasn't trivial to understand, thus the learning curve was steep for that particular feature. It didn't feel intuitive enough to a new user with a lack of experience in online repositories. And the basics of GitLab are easy to learn and to use, but after that, the learning curve gets very steep. So that was a very common kind of sentiment in that it's hard to kind of get going. There's a lot of features in GitLab, and using them to the utmost potential for a user was hard to do and hard to learn. So I won't spend too much time here because I'll go into detail later, but some examples of how we can help users learn GitLab is provide more guidance and in-context help in the UI, more examples and tutorials in the documentation, and making it easier to locate commonly needed information and features. Another set of themes that, again, was part of the reason our overall SUS was what it was, is users are encountering complex and cumbersome experiences. So the questions related to complexity and cumbersomeness were also relatively low. I think a lot of this had to do around navigation and discoverability. I think the underlying sentiment was that like I said, GitLab has a lot of features, but utilizing those features, figuring out how and when to use them was intimidating and complicated. I believe one user basically made the comparison that GitLab was Linux and GitHub was Mac, and that GitLab was much more feature rich, but was also that came with lower usability. And so that was kind of meaningful in this, and that it's feature rich, but it is complicated. And as I mentioned earlier, difficult to learn. So some examples of how we can reduce complexity in GitLab: reduce visual clutter in the interface, help users complete tasks without context switching, things like that. So if we take a deeper look at SUS themes, I pulled out the top 6 themes that we heard. Some of these are ones I've mentioned before, like I mentioned, complexity, learnability. We also saw things related to missing features and functionality, specifically mobile integration came up a number of times in the verbatims. I mentioned navigation and discoverability in context with complexity. Again, there's this idea of feature bloat and busy UIs making it difficult for users to navigate quickly, find the features that would be useful to them, and actually learning how to use those features. And then overall, a general usability issue, and then in particularly with the merge request experience. So what we're doing now, as I kind of have alluded to, a lot of it revolves around improving learnability. But in general, our product and UX departments have jointly agreed to have a shared OKR every quarter to focus on usability. And so every quarter, we choose to focus on one of the top 6 SUS themes. In this case, it's learnability. But as part of the FY22Q2 OKR to increase the SUS score to 72.5, we're looking at features around missing functionality and general usability. So one of those OKRs is helping drive category maturity forward by pre-validating jobs to be done. As I mentioned, another main focus of this quarter and next quarter is learnability. And so this quarter, we conducted a follow-up study with participants from last year's SUS to basically compare now versus a year ago. And what the underlying theme, they're pretty consistent actually, it was the theme was that learnability was the most common reason GitLab wasn't easy to use. What we saw was a slight improvement in usability over last year, but the main reason why behind their ratings was whether they were getting used to it or not. And basically, were they developing a cow path through GitLab, learning what they needed and kind of ignoring the more complicated tasks or features. And to kind of further address this issue, there's an OKR for this quarter aimed at understanding and improving the learnability of GitLab. And particularly, again, improve SUS by evaluating the learnability of our product. This is kind of key. Is if we can make GitLab more learnable, we can make GitLab more usable. In particular, we're planning to conduct a longitudinal study where we follow GitLab users from basically right when they join and have their first experience with the product, and following them for up to 8 weeks and seeing how they learn, what their obstacles are, what their pain points are, where can we facilitate learning, and how can we make the product more usable. So a silver lining for the overall SUS is that the user's desire to frequently use GitLab remains very high. It's one of the only questions that's never dropped below target in terms of the individual SUS questions. Although it has been on this downward trend, the question still remains above target, and that's really positive to see. In addition to that, a general positivity as a theme was also very common. About 23% of all the verbatims were generally positive, with frequent emphasis on improvements at GitLab. So that was also really nice to see. There's some additional information in the appendix for you to look at, what is the system usability scale, how we run the survey, and some additional resources, including the raw data for you to take a look at. But thank you for listening.